big house. And he bought me this house for my 50th birthday.
Was a rainy night, like the king went down. Everybody was crying, it seemed like sadness had surrounded the...
Like many icons of the 1970s, Phil Lynott struggled to come to terms with the decade that followed. His first attempt at reinvention was to form the rock powerhouse he christened Grand Slam.
I think Lizzy had been a long trip, you know, it'd been a long road trip for him. You know, he was a creative guy, and, you know, we all want to write and be creative, and sometimes you need a slightly different plane to go on, and I think Grand Slam was his way of doing that.
When it came to putting Grand Slam together, I think Phil chose really wisely. On keyboards, he took Mark Stanway, excellent player, a lot of experience, really good songwriter. On guitar, he took Lawrence Archer, really, really underrated guitarist. And he completed the band with pretty much two unknowns. Deutsch Nagel was the rhythm guitarist, Robbie Brennan was the drummer.
You know, we really just fell into it straight away. It was like a dream come true for me, plus Phil was a hero.
I thought they had incredible songs. Some people didn't like them just because they were different to Lizzy, but I thought that was the whole point.
Grand Slam rapidly built up a large and loyal following.
The response was just absolutely mad. It was crazy. Something that I hadn't really seen in my career before.
There was some great stuff on the Grand Slam period. It was all just too rushed.
I said, baby.
They wouldn't be as greedy as the Greedy Bastards. But you know, I seen Grand Slamming with Robbie Brennan and Deutsch and the boys and doing their best, but big trouble because you have Tin Lizzy and you have Grand Slam, there's no comparison.
And they'd formed Grand Slam, which is okay, but it wasn't Lizzy.
Despite Grand Slam's large fan base, they failed to sign a record deal.
There was a few bad moments in the press which basically put a bit of a stigma on Phil's entourage, which stopped us getting a major deal.
I think Phil was just as confused as everybody else, the fact that Grand Slam didn't get a record deal. Why they didn't get signed, I suppose you'd have to ask the nation's A&R men. They had the songs, they had the repertoire, they had the confidence, but I think his reputation as a hellraiser and perhaps just as a general loose cannon had a lot to do with that.
Following this difficult period, Phil began to enjoy solo success.
In the end, Phil did get a deal with the songs that we originally wrote for Grand Slam.
The subject of Phil's solo career is something that I still think kind of splits Thin Lizzy fans down the middle. There were those like myself that kind of craved him to do the balls-out hard rock that we knew him for, and yet by the same token he was perfectly happy to go and do stuff like Yellow Pearl with Mid-Jour, which later became the theme tune for Top of the Pops, and also to experiment in things like reggae.
It was a good opportunity for him to show himself off again, show that he was still on form, show that he was still a contender.
Phil worked with Gary Moore on a couple of occasions and it was always worth waiting for. Parisian Walkways was a monster hit, and justifiably so. Further down the line they got together and did Out in the Fields, which was another fantastic song. The two of them were a phenomenal partnership.
He was still extremely gifted, talented man. And he still wrote amazing lyrics, still wrote great songs, still a great singer, great showman. But he knew the direction now that he needed to go in.
He became more aware of his black roots. He started a band with black guys like Jerome, and he found himself. But he found himself just a bit too late.
If you see Stevie Wonder, tell him I hear. If you hear little Stevie Wonder, tell him I see.
The last hit that Phil had was a solo hit. It was a great song actually called 19, which dated back to the days of Grand Slam. But the interesting thing about it was actually produced by Paul Hardcastle, who had a hit single of his own called 19. It was the way that Phil would like to have gone had Lizzy continued, which was his intention at that time.
Despite Phil's successful solo career, life after Lizzy seemed empty to him. He had created a myth so powerful, he never managed to outgrow it. Another major blow for Phil was his exclusion from Live Aid.
Live Aid was by far the biggest gig in history at the time and the biggest gig in Philip's lifetime. And he was profoundly depressed and shocked that he wasn't invited to perform. And that precipitated his end in many ways.
Thin Lizzy were probably the archetypal rock and roll band in England. It would have dented his ego, and he would have felt he's now not in contention like a heavyweight boxer. He wasn't world champion still, and I think he would have been hurt. Do you know what I mean? More than angry, he'd have been really disappointed.
You know, Philip was a problem at that point in his own life, but Lizzy should have been at that.
Phil's escalating use of heroin was beginning to take its toll, despite the efforts of those closest to him.
He was on a big, massive downward spiral that included everything from amphetamines to booze to heroin to cocaine, you name it, he took it. And he felt he had the physique to withstand it, which he did. He was a very strong physique, he was a powerful man. But heroin sort of has a cortisone-like effect. It puts on weight while destroying the inner body and the inner soul.
I could see it coming. He was looking more like Elvis every day. He was putting on the weight, he was starting to bloat, but you couldn't tell him. I did have a serious conversation with him one time in Glencore, and at first he was listening to me, but then he was okay. And eventually he threw me out.
Because I knew he was getting more and more seriously into the wrong side of things. And I suppose, I hate to say inevitable, but it was starting to look that way. But I never lectured him, and you do once in a while say, it's not a good idea, because I've had lots of my friends who've passed away because of drugs. And the same thing happens with drink eventually. But I think drugs just speed it up a little bit.
For every guy that's trying to stop you, there's 150 trying to give you something. And all the 155 are saying that you're the biggest bollocks of all time for trying to interfere with them, Unfortunately, you get a little bit of paranoid with the people who like them the most.
There's no doubt about it. His persona began to disintegrate, and he began to get very insecure about everything. And I speak personally about this because I was a victim of it.
He didn't want you invading his privacy. He had this sort of wall. I noticed that when certain people said something to him about his lifestyle, he would go, "Stay out of me fucking head."
His friends were there for him, always, The problem is that Philip didn't recognise that towards the end.
Jim was doing his best, everybody was doing their best, but, there was nothing you could say around that time.
He would always do what it took to sort you out. It's a bit sad that other people didn't do it for him. And I wish to God I'd have been in the position at the time to do it for him, because I would have. Unfortunately, he'd got into that stage where there was too many other people about it.
We did have a long talk about the whole narcotics and drugs scenario. I was actually quite a quick, clean living boy at that point. And he used to talk to me about it because I think he felt he could talk to me about it. He did say to me on many occasions, that I would really like to get away from this. And there was one particular time where he did make quite a severe effort to get what we would call clean, I suppose, or away from this, entourage of people that were, barraging it towards him.
Once Phil's addiction took hold, he used heroin not to get high, but to feel normal.
Phil was the opposite to the self-destruct. Phil was a self-preservationist. I don't think he was going down that road of self-destruction at all. I think that's something that everyone says about someone that either dies or has an experience with it, or they're into self-destruction. I don't think most people self-destruct on purpose.
And who's to say some people can do that and live on till whatever age and do whatever, but I wouldn't, it wasn't a purposely self-destructive lifestyle.
There's a lot of guys that got very heavily into drugs and got off them. And I reckon that he was in the process of getting off them, that's my opinion. And at this day I believe that if everything had been going well, he would have got off them. That's all I know. And that's what he said, and I believed him.
It was Christmas time, and I arrived at the house, and he was spending a lot of time in bed, but the Christmas tree was up, the stockings were hanging on the mantelpiece, the Christmas tree was packed with all the prezzies named, labelled, you name it, and I noticed that there was a drip coming down from the ceiling in the hallway, and I ran up the stairs, and my Philip was lying in a bath full of water, in full blue jeans, and the water was flowing over. He was like floating. I said, Mercy, what is going on? I pulled the plug out. He said, Ma'am, I'm freezing. I don't know how I did it. He was 6 foot odd, and the weight of his jeans, and I got him out of that bath, and I got him to the bed. He leaned on me. I got him to the bed, and I started to take his clothes off, but he didn't want me to touch his trousers. I said, I brought you into the world, I'm taking those trousers off. And I got him and I wrapped him in everything. And I warmed him as best I could, and that was that. We got him to the hospital, and the next time I saw him, he was in a bed. And he was there, and he was propped up, and he was able to speak. And I sat at the foot of the bed, and I said, give us a smile. And he went, And I thought, that's fine. I didn't know Philip was going to die. But he did ask for a priest before he died. And somebody told me, the priest is coming to see Philip. I said, no, don't bring a priest in to see Philip. I said, if he sees his colour, I said, he'll get a fright. They said,